We'll be talking about some of those games that were played, some of the upsets, some of the biggest games we had, and some observations. And then in the second half of the episode, I'm going to be talking about this weekend's upcoming games. So you should be getting this on Thursday, a couple days before we get into all those great games that we have coming up. But to start the episode, I want to talk about the upset of the weekend. And there were a few. We had a few upsets happen over the weekend. But the one I want to talk about really quick is Virginia Tech at West Virginia. Not a game a whole lot of people were probably looking at, but Virginia Tech worked their way all the way up to 15th in the country. Then went on the road to lose 27-21 to the Mountaineers. Really with a lot of their trouble being ineffective run game and then an inability to stop the run. Virginia Tech only averaged 2.5 yards a carry. Now they had 106 yards and a touchdown on the ground, but they gave up 173 yards off of 5.2 yards a carry and a touchdown, which was really more like 8 yards a carry because their top two rushers, Letty Brown and Garrett Green, averaged around 8 yards a carry on the game. But with that, the reason I bring this game up is more so because of the position Virginia Tech was in heading into the game, which is probably as an overrated team. They came into the year with Justin Fuente, head coach, on the hot seat, losing a lot of production and talented players from last season, and I had them having a bad year. Now, they start off the year beating North Carolina, a top 10 team, and that to me is more so indicative of how overrated North Carolina was heading into the season. And I fed into it. I thought North Carolina was going to have a really good season. So far, they've struggled a little bit, with that loss to Virginia Tech being a big black eye for them to start the year. So I think North Carolina came in overrated, and I think Virginia Tech got too big a bump for beating them, if I'm being honest. I don't think Virginia Tech was the 15th best team in the country when they played West Virginia. But with that loss, Virginia Tech has since fallen outside of the top 25, and Justin Fuente is kind of back on the hot seat again with that loss as a favorite. And if that game was played at home, maybe Virginia Tech wins that ball game, but they did not. So they fall out of the top 25, and that was a pretty big upset there. One that I somewhat saw coming, I didn't really put it out there because I wasn't going to put too much time into the Virginia Tech-West Virginia game. But every week you can see a few games where you're thinking, man, that feels like an upset, and that's a game I'm going to bet money on. And, they lost that football game. Now, next up, I have a quick topic I want to talk about and just see how the audience feels. The state of Michigan has two teams in the top 25 right now. Michigan and Michigan State. Michigan comes in at 19th, Michigan State at 20th. Both 3-0. And what's the overall feeling on them right now? Who do people think is actually the better team? The AP poll says by a narrow margin, Michigan, coming in one spot above Michigan State. You look at the seasons they've had thus far. Michigan taking down Western Michigan, Washington, and Northern Illinois, easily taking down those teams. 14-47 win, 10-31 win, 10-63 win. They're led by Blake Corum, who's kind of sneaking his way into Heisman conversation. Meanwhile, they have the number one run game in the country. Michigan State, meanwhile, beat Northwestern, who was a really good team last year, but Northwestern is having a very down year this season. They're just not a very good team. Beat them 21-38, although they started off, I believe, 21-0, beating Northwestern. They were dominant in the beginning of that game. Youngstown State 14-42 in Miami. That was a 24th ranked Miami team, 17-38. So Michigan State led by running back Kenneth Walker, who's also having a phenomenal season. And Peyton Thorne, their starting quarterback, has a 9-0 touchdown interception ratio. Both defenses are playing really well, and they're fairly similar teams in terms of their style of play thus far. But who's the better team? We're going to find out eventually because these are two teams that are going to square off. But it's not ridiculous to assume that either team can be undefeated by the time these two meet up. If not undefeated with one loss on their record. Michigan's got Wisconsin next week. Michigan State has a lot of winnable games. But this is going to be a really interesting matchup. I think that, I had this as my game of the week in the offseason, it looks like it's going to be a top 25 matchup by the time it's played, which even more so justifies my selection for making that my game of the year. But two similar teams, let me know who you guys think is going to win that matchup when the time comes, and who do you think is the better team? Who's having the better year? It's really hard to say. I mean, both haven't played the hardest schedules. You know, you look at Michigan State, they did beat a top 25 Miami. You know, they were ranked 24th in the country. But Miami gets destroyed by Alabama. They have a very close game with Appalachian State. Then they lose at home to Michigan State. Miami is clearly a team in disarray. Youngstown State, nothing to write home about. Northwestern's having a terrible year. And then you look at Michigan's schedule. I mean, Western Michigan, solid MAC team. Washington having a down year, thus far at least. And Northern Illinois was a winless team last year. So neither has beat very strong competition, and they've both done so very convincingly. So it's close right now, and this matchup is going to be fantastic by the time it's played. I already see it heating up in between these two fan bases. So let me know who you guys think is the better team. You know, Michigan or Michigan State. Those are two teams that came into the season outside the top 25 and now have earned a lot of respect to start this season. So let me know what you guys think about that. But with that said, let's jump into some of the games that were played, the best games of the week, and I've got two that I want to talk about. The first being Alabama versus Florida. Now, Alabama went on the road to play Florida, and it was kind of an interesting game. Bryce Young took over the game early, putting 3 touchdowns on Florida in the first quarter alone. Alabama was up 21-3 to start the game. Came out of the second quarter 21-9. So it was all Bryce Young for Alabama in the first half. I don't know if Florida really gave Alabama, a real scare or not in this game. That's kind of how it's being talked about, because you look at the scoreboard, 31-29. I get that. Alabama goes on the road to take down Florida in Gainesville, 31-29. Now, people have looked at the score and said, oh, Alabama just survives. They hold off the Gators. I don't know how much I believe that, only because you look at how this game went. It was 21-3 at the end of the first quarter. I mean, Bryce Young dropped 3 whole touchdowns on them in one quarter. After that, it was 21-9 going into the second half of the game. Florida had nothing going offensively. They had a rushing touchdown in the second quarter, but missed a field goal. So it was really in the second half. Brian Robinson had himself a rushing touchdown in the third quarter. Only a field goal for Alabama in the fourth. And if Florida could have effectively thrown the football, then maybe this would have been a loss for Alabama if they didn't turn things back up more in the second half. But Emory Jones, not very effective throwing the football. 195 yards and an interception. This was a game all on the ground for them. They had 3 different guys with rushing touchdowns in this game. 3 out of those 4 in the second half. Now, yes, a 2-point conversion would have tied this game had Florida converted that, but there was still plenty of time left in the game for Alabama to go down and score again. They were able to just ride this game out. Florida had opportunities to win, don't get me wrong, but Alabama did not allow that to happen. And I don't think that Alabama survives. I don't like wording it that way. If Florida really never has the lead or takes control of the game. So for that reason, I just don't like wording it as, Alabama survives. And no, this isn't the most dominant Alabama team that we've ever seen. But when you look at how much they had to replace from last year, a couple of wide receivers, a few offensive linemen, your quarterback, your running back, a defensive tackle, a corner, tons of talent they had to replace. It's going to be hard after only 3 weeks to be as dominant as you were. And they've still beaten 2 top 25 teams. One of which on the road, in the form of the Florida Gators, and the other in a neutral field against Miami. So the state of Florida must really hate Alabama this year. But Bryce Young, still the favorite for the Heisman right now. He's had a fantastic start to the season. The only real problem is their run game. Robinson has had a really slow start to the season, and I think that's what they're missing the most, if anything, would be Najee Harris's presence at running back, and to their credit, some really talented offensive linemen that Alabama has had to replace. But with that, Alabama still undefeated, still a long way to go on the year, but it's hard to predict a loss for them this season when, Texas A&M hasn't looked very convincing. Ole Miss, I think, is really overrated at 13th, if I'm being honest. I don't personally know why Ole Miss is all the way up at 13 when they haven't beat anybody. I don't care that they put up 61 on Tulane or 54 on Austin Peay. So I don't understand why Ole Miss has gone all the way up. Personally, when I look at that as creating excitement for the Alabama-Ole Miss game, that realistically, Alabama should dominate. Now, if I have to bite my tongue and Ole Miss pulls that game off, or it's even really competitive, maybe I'll take it back. But Ole Miss isn't the 13th best team in the country. We just kind of want them to be. Sometimes that happens in the AP poll or the coaches poll. So Alabama still as dominant as ever. I had issues with Florida coming into the year. I don't think they're going to have a great season, but they're only 2-1 right now. Have plenty of very winnable games. So we'll see where Florida goes from here. But moving on, let's go on to my best game of the week. It was the game I chose as the best game of the week for the season, Auburn at Penn State. It was a whiteout game. I'm not going to waste 5 minutes of your time talking about how great a Penn State whiteout is, because everywhere you look, people just like to ramble on every time Penn State has a whiteout. Yes, it's one of the best environments in college football. I love a good whiteout. It was a fantastic environment, and it was great for this top 20. It was great for this matchup against top 25 teams, and at that, an SEC team coming into Big Ten country. You don't see that very often. A top 25 SEC team coming into a Big Ten school and playing that regular season game, but they did, and it was a good one. I mean, at no point did either team really step forward and dominate. I mean, on the scoreboard, at one point it was 21-10 Penn State's lead in the third quarter, but Auburn responded and Tank Bigsby got himself a touchdown to 17-21. Next thing you know, a field goal to kick off the fourth quarter gets them, to 21-20, and it's anybody's ball game. So that was a really good game to watch. I like that it was exciting and, competitive throughout. If I could ask for anything, it's that maybe we had a few more lead changes after the second quarter to just keep things fun. But it went Auburn's lead, Penn State's lead, Auburn's lead, and then once Penn State took the lead at the end of the second quarter, they did hold it. But good for Auburn putting up a competitive football game. This is the first year for that program's new head coach, Brian Harsin. Talked about how I like his hiring for Auburn, but I didn't know how it was going to start for him, especially taking over, with this SEC schedule coming from Boise State. But so far he's had a really respectable 2-1 start. Dominated a couple teams, had a really competitive game with Penn State. I will say I wish Bo Nix was more of a contributor here. He didn't do a whole lot wrong, but when you complete 21 of 37 for 185 yards, you don't put your team in the end zone, but you don't turn it over, which, is nice. I just wish he was a bit more of a contributor, and if that had occurred, Auburn wins that football game. But Tank Bigsby, he led the way for them with 2 touchdowns in the game, and that was definitely what kept them in the game. But overall, I was actually fairly impressed with Sean Clifford. He completed 28 out of 32 passes for Penn State. And one of those incompletions was an interception, but 280 yards and 2 turnovers. He's actually done the most for their offense and not the run game, with Noah Cain. I've actually been pretty disappointed with Noah Cain's start to the year. So far, his season high has been 69 yards, and that was against Ball State. Now, don't get me wrong, he played a really difficult Wisconsin defense, and Auburn is no slouch either. Better games are coming up for Noah Cain in that Penn State run game. But right now, it looks like Penn State is the team to beat in the Big Ten, right? I mean, they're 3-0. They've beat Auburn, Wisconsin, and maybe Penn State's going to make me eat my words. I had them having a disappointing year this year, as in like a 9-3 type of season. But it looks like the Big Ten is up for grabs. Anybody could go out and get it. And right now, Penn State seems to be taking the lead on that. And they just got over 2 massive hurdles on their schedule that I wasn't sure they were going to get out of. I thought they were going to be 2-1 coming out of their first 3 games, but they're 3-0 right now. They get a nice game against Villanova. They get Indiana, which is a revenge game for them. And it looks like Penn State at Iowa is going to be an absolutely bonkers football game. Because Iowa loves to beat some of those juggernauts of the Big Ten. Your Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. Just spoil your season. But right now, Iowa's trying to avoid spoiling their own. They're the 5th ranked team in the country right now. Penn State is 6. So that's really awesome just because we're so used to Ohio State leading the way for the Big Ten, but right now it's Iowa and Penn State. So that game, on the edge of my seat for that. I really hope these are both undefeated teams by the time it's played, which realistically it will be, considering Iowa's got Colorado and Maryland. So unless there's a big upset there, we're going to have a battle between 2 undefeated teams in the top 10 of the Big Ten. I'm just getting excited thinking about it, if you can't already tell. And then, just to kind of round it out with one of the other big games that was played, Cincinnati took on Indiana. It's an 8th-ranked Cincinnati team, but they really lost the first half of that game in my mind. And I question if Cincinnati is a top 10 team for that reason. Indiana, they're 1-2 right now. They did lose that Cincinnati game, and they got destroyed by Iowa. But they started that game off 14-0. And in large part due to mistakes by Cincinnati. Now, of course, to end the first half, that game ended up being 14-10. And then after that, Cincinnati was able to run with it for a while, but Indiana came back to with a field goal to take the lead 24-23 to end the third quarter. So it was anybody's ball game. Really, this team is living and dying off of Michael Penix Jr., and when you live and die off Michael Penix Jr., you're going to lose football games, but you're going to win some too. And he gave them a lot of good moments. I'm not trying to rain on the Michael Penix parade, but he's got a 4-6 touchdown interception ratio on the year. He was an obvious issue for them against Iowa, tossing 3 interceptions, which you can understand with Iowa's defense to a degree. They didn't throw 3 interceptions against Cincinnati. And I just have to wonder if maybe it's time to talk about moving on from him. He is a great talent. But I say the same thing about Adrian Martinez for Nebraska. If you're going to tie your hip to a athletic playmaker who looks good in practice, can give you big plays against any team in the country, but is going to make a lot of mistakes, then you're going to live and die by that sword. And when you've got Penn State coming up, Michigan State, Ohio State, Michigan. By the way, all those teams are in the top 25. Yeah, I think a quarterback change might happen for Indiana if Michael Penix continues to struggle. And don't get me wrong, I'm not sure who would replace him, but I just know that type of play shouldn't be tolerated by the Indiana program. With that, again, it's not all on him. I actually give a lot of credit to the Indiana defense. They played a really good football game for quite a while. I know you look at 38 points given up to the Bearcats, but they played a really good game. They need to fix their run game as well. Stephen Carr is just doing what Carr does, the USC transfer, averaging 2.5 yards a carry in the game. Only 3.5 on the season. So you really can't be surprised by that. He's been an average running back, really a below-average running back his entire career between USC and now Indiana. So Indiana's got some things to figure out. I made my prediction in the offseason that they will not finish as a top 25 team, and it looks like that's not going to happen. And like I said for Cincinnati, I don't think they're a top 10 team. Just with the struggles they had, with how off Desmond Ridder was for half of that football game, he did not look like himself. and they were heavily, heavily penalized. 11 penalties for 72 yards. That absolutely killed them. And just turnovers by Indiana is what caused them to lose this football game. But with that said, that's kind of my preview, or that's kind of my overview for the weekend. Just wanted to throw out a few things for that game. Now let's talk a little bit about this upcoming week of games that we have for this Saturday. Obviously, the best game of the weekend is 12th ranked Notre Dame playing 18th ranked Wisconsin in Chicago, Illinois. So I'm really excited for this football game, as anybody should. It's the reason why I made it my best game of the week in the offseason. And I have my opinion on who's going to win this game. But let's talk about where these two teams are coming into the year. It's kind of interesting when you look at, Wisconsin, 18th ranked team in the country, started off with a loss against Penn State at home, 16-10. It helps them a little bit that it was a low-scoring defensive battle. It was pretty much anybody's game over the entire course of the evening. Come off that with a home win against Eastern Michigan, clear the outmatched opponent 34-7. Then they get a bye week. So they get to come off of a bye week to play Notre Dame in a neutral field versus a Notre Dame team who struggled mightily at Florida State in week 1. That game went into overtime. They barely won that 41-38 with a field goal. Mind you, Florida State came out with a missed field goal themselves that could have won them the game. And then they struggle against Toledo 32-29. Also at home. Beat Purdue 27-13. Thing with that game is they never really dominated. They may have been in control of the ball game for the most part, but they clearly outmatched Purdue, and it was at home. So you have 3 subpar performances in a row against teams far less talented than that of Notre Dame. Now, the positives that Wisconsin has is that their defense is clearly very good. Jack Sanborn is a fantastic inside linebacker. He's going to be playing on Sundays for sure. He's got 6 tackles and a sack on the season. They have 4 sacks in 2 games, and of course, it's a small sample size. But when you've played a top 25 Penn State team who's 5th ranked team in the country right now, when you've played a top 25 Penn State who's the 6th ranked team in the country, they got to get some reps in against Eastern Michigan. The defense is going to be good in this game. And I think Wisconsin clearly has the defensive advantage. Marcus Freeman, current defensive coordinator for them, came over from Cincinnati. He's had a rough start to his tenure with the Fighting Irish. And they are just going to be outclassed on the defensive side of the ball, in my mind, when you're stacking the 2 defenses. Meanwhile, I'd have to say that Wisconsin probably also has the advantage in the run game. Ches Malusi has 265 yards and 2 touchdowns just in their first 2 games of the season. But Isaac Jordan, but Wisconsin also has a collection of running backs that are more than capable of carrying the football behind him. The problem for them, and this is what's going to really make this a football game in my mind. And don't get me wrong, Notre Dame has some good running backs. You know what I mean? Kyron Williams is a talented player, 211 yards, 2 touchdowns on the season. Talented running back. But I don't think it stacks up to that of Notre Dame. But I don't think it stacks up to what Wisconsin can do at the running back position. And Michael Mayer, phenomenal tight end. 5-star coming out of high school, great player, leads the team in receiving yards and touchdowns and catches. Behind him is Williams at running back. So far Jack Cohen really hasn't been hitting their wide receivers very much. But Notre Dame's got the quarterback advantage as of right now. Jack Cohen was the starting quarterback for Wisconsin last year and transferred over to Notre Dame, where he's having a great start to the season. 8 touchdowns to 2 interceptions, 828 yards in 3 games, completing 63% of his passes. And to compare that to Graham Mertz, the starting quarterback for Wisconsin, who took the starting job from Jack Cohen, 326 yards, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Not having the start to the season that Wisconsin was hoping he would when they decided, the highly recruited quarterback out of high school, out of the state of Wisconsin, was going to be their starter for them. Considering they have a lot of good receiving weapons, Davis the third, Ferguson at tight end, they're having a really disappointing start to the season trying to get that passing game going. And that could be their downfall. Jack Cohn, he could definitely get his revenge on Wisconsin in this game. Do it in Chicago, Illinois. That's really the equalizer here for me, it's Jack Cohn and the great start he's had to the season. And Graham Mertz having a pretty bad start to the year. So, you hear all these advantages for Wisconsin. Girls, stop. Lay down. Run game, defense, probably offensive line. Just because Notre Dame has had to replace so many offensive linemen from last season. I think they had to replace 3 starters. But when you have the quarterback advantage, and he knows that team, and he knows that defense, Notre Dame could obviously win this football game. I think Wisconsin wins at 24-21, with most of their damage being done on the ground. And I think Graham Mertz gets his first passing touchdown of the year. But with that said, that does not totally determine this game, because it's a neutral site game, because Notre Dame's got the better quarterback in my eyes right now. And so it's really hard to say. There's a lot of different factors in this one. But I think it's going to be a good one. And I think Wisconsin wins 24-17. Now, the next game I want to talk about is Texas A&M at Arkansas. So this is obviously a really interesting matchup when you consider the position Arkansas is in right now. They're the 16th ranked team in the country, which is in a position where they're surprising people with the level of success they're having. And a lot of it comes down to their coaching staff. I don't think that Arkansas is under this revolutionary change because their schedule is murderer's row. You've got Texas A&M, Georgia, Ole Miss, Auburn. 4 straight top 25 teams. Wouldn't be surprising if they lost all of them. And that's not talking about at LSU, at Alabama. Terrible schedule, probably the worst in the country. But they got over their first hurdle. And that's why I'm waiting to get a little too excited about Arkansas. They've only gotten over one hurdle, and that's Texas, who they got to play at home, who's under a new coaching staff, who has a lot of issues at the quarterback position. Now, they won in part because of those issues. They also won because their run game was so good against Texas. I don't think it's going to be as good against Texas A&M, who has a defense with names like DeMarvin Leal, Antonio Johnson, Aaron Hansford. Just a really talented defense, one of the best in the SEC, honestly. And the real reason why I think 7th-ranked Texas A&M can be in trouble, and we're going to jump into talking about their team a little bit first, is because of the quarterback position. Haynes King, but the real issue for them is the quarterback position. Haynes King struggled a little bit early on in the season, but he tossed 3 interceptions against Kent State. But going down, injury that's going to have him out until probably mid-October, there's even more questions at the quarterback spot now, with Zach Calzada taking over. Now, can Zach Calzada do enough for them to win at quarterback? Yes. But against Colorado, they only pulled out of that game 10-7, and he was 18 of 38 for 183 yards and a touchdown. Subpar against a subpar Colorado team. Looked a lot better against the University of New Mexico, but it's the University of New Mexico. Calzada's going to be fine for them at quarterback. But if they need him to be more than fine against Arkansas, you might have yourself a problem. Now with Isaiah Spiller leading the way at the running back position, good depth at that spot, David Achene behind him, I think I said that name right, I don't know. They're going to be fine. Jalen Weidermeyer is a phenomenal tight end. He actually leads the team in receiving yards right now. Number 1 wide receiver, Anaya Smith, 135 yards and 2 touchdowns on the season. He's their number 1 wide receiver for the team. They've got the weapons. They've got the running backs. They've got the defense. But do they have the quarterback? That's really the problem. It actually kind of sounds a lot like Wisconsin when I was talking about that game earlier, where It seems like Wisconsin's got everything they might want, but it has not been the quarterback position. And then as for Arkansas, again, their shining moment was destroying Texas. It was dominating Texas on the ground. I just don't know if Arkansas is going to be able to do that against A&M, who has a much better defense than Texas. Now, if they do, they're legit. Traylon Smith, really good running back for them, off to a great start on the season. But it's not just him. It's Sanders out there as well, who can carry the football. Dominique Johnson actually tied for the lead on the season so far in rushing touchdowns with Smith. And KJ Jefferson, their starting quarterback, not the best at moving the ball through the air, but he's got a strong arm and he can do that. But he's got 180 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground himself this season. So their run game is just taking over games, and that's going to be what they try to do against Texas A&M. If they do it, Arkansas is a top 10 team, and they're legit. And we're going to be looking at Arkansas, led now by Sam Pittman, who wants to have strong offensive line play and have a strong run game. We're going to talk about them, hey, can they beat Ole Miss? Can they beat Auburn? Could they upset, one of these elite teams in the SEC? That's how you're going to start talking about Arkansas this season. But they got to beat A&M to do that. Texas A&M, meanwhile, they're the 7th-ranked team in the country. They want to make the playoff. They thought they should have been a playoff team last season. So they don't want to lose a game like this to Arkansas when they have enough struggles coming up later in the year. Texas A&M still has to play Alabama. They've still got to play Auburn and Ole Miss and LSU. So they need to win this game against Arkansas, which has quickly become sort of a potential upset here. Granted, it's going to be played in Arlington, Texas, so it's a neutral site. Favors Texas A&M more than Arkansas. I have Texas A&M winning the game. I say they win 31-20. I have them winning 31-13 and really taking care of business against Arkansas. Now, if this is a nail-biter or a really competitive game, then I'm really going to kick myself for that prediction of 31-13. But I just don't think that Arkansas is going to be able to run the football very well against A&M. I have a feeling they're going to be able to create turnovers on KJ Jefferson, and their offense is going to do a lot better than maybe we expected them to do. Maybe 31 is a generous estimate. I have Texas A&M winning this game 27-13 over Arkansas. I have them creating turnovers on KJ Jefferson at quarterback. I don't have Arkansas running the football all that effectively. I think they'll be able to score some points and keep A&M fairly in check, but I just don't think Arkansas can beat not only Texas, but also Texas A&M to start the season. I'd love to see Arkansas win this game because that would be a real shock, and I think it's nice to see that in college football. But ultimately, I have A&M winning the football game. And with that, those are probably the 2 biggest games of the weekend. Now, there's a sneaky game that I'll talk about real quick, maybe one other, and that's LSU at Ole Miss. Now, I have one game I'll talk about, maybe 2, that is kind of going under the radar, but you should definitely keep an eye on, and that's LSU at Mississippi State. Now, obviously, Mississippi State is outmatched in this game, but they can most certainly surprise with the amount of points that their offense can put up. Will Rogers has 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns on the season to only 1 interception. That, to me, is a bad recipe for LSU that so far has struggled a little bit to put up points. Mississippi State coming off a loss to Memphis. Granted, it was a close 31-29 loss. I just want to be surprised at all if they figure out a way to beat LSU. Now, granted, they upset LSU last year at the beginning of the year, and that's, kind of what set LSU's season all into disarray, was losing to Mississippi State. Don't know if they'll be able to do that again. Mississippi State's run game is non-existent, but I think that they can put up enough points to take down LSU. Granted, LSU has a great secondary, but hasn't really been performing like the great secondary that we believe it is. And if Ed Orgeron loses this football game, you could very well see him getting fired. This has quickly become a must-win football game for Ed Orgeron there. And I would love Mike Leach to somehow figure out a way to make LSU an almost rivalry game between LSU and Mississippi State, and just brewing hatred between those 2 programs if he manages to beat LSU for a second year in a row. So with that, everybody, that's the games I'm going to cover for the weekend. Just wanted to give you guys a quick preview of kind of some of the games we're looking out for and have coming up, and I wanted to give you my input on those. Hopefully you guys liked the preview. Hope you enjoyed the overview of the previous weekend. I want to drop another short video talking about just sort of where we are 1/4 of the way into the season. You know what I mean? We're going into week 4, 3 full weeks in, 25% of the way through the year. And what's the vibe right now? Where are we at? Have some of my off-season predictions come true, or have they already been killed? I want to talk about some of those things, but right now that's the end of this episode, and thanks for listening, everybody.